everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the concept of a timeline, which is universal to all video editing software. And I will also take you on a tour of the VSDC interface so that you will understand what all these various windows are about, what they do, and you will not be intimidated when you start your first project. Let's begin. The most fundamental way that you would be interacting with your video is to watch it again and again. So at the heart of the interface is this TV screen-like thing, which is called the viewer or the viewing monitor. And you can play, pause, fast forward or rewind using the VCR buttons below it. And the content that you are playing on the screen is whatever you have on your timeline, which is where you build your project. This is a good point to remember because a video is a series of images that move very quickly over time. So if you stretch a clip out on your timeline like this, you can see this series of images. They are small copies of your frames called thumbnails. So unlike photo editing where you are only focusing on editing one image at a time, video editing software needs to give you a way to work with the concept of time. And that's why there is a timeline. It moves from left to right as your video plays. And there's this ruler scale on top, which shows you how much time has passed since the beginning of your video. You also have multiple layers, which in VSDC are called layers, although other video editing software may call them tracks. For every different thing that you want to appear at the same time, it needs to have its own layer. And for items that are visual, such as images or video clips, the order of the layers is important. So in this example, I have two images that overlap, and the one that is on top in the timeline appears on top in the screen as well. And when I exchange the two layers like this, then the one that was below now comes on top. So this thing is called the cursor, or in other video editing software, they may call it the playhead. So it shows you what point in your timeline that you are currently playing. What's on your screen is what would show at that particular point of time in your video. You can move this cursor back and forth, or if you want to be really precise frame by frame, then you hit the left and right arrow buttons to move to the right or to the left. So always remember that to the right means that you are moving forward in time and to the left is backwards. And since everything that you're doing in your video has a very close relationship with time, you need to have an accurate way of measuring time in your video editing software. This is called the time code. In VSDC, a time code is expressed in hours, minutes, seconds, and milliseconds. That is why you have 3 digits behind the seconds, because you can have up to 999 milliseconds before you get to the next second. Remember that 1 millisecond is 1/1000th of a second. If you have tried other software, you might see a different format of time code where you have the hours, the minutes, the seconds, and then 2 digits after the seconds. This is because they may express the time codes in terms of hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. And typically, we still work with 2 digits numbers of frames per second. Usually, we would be working with 24 or 30 FPS, like I mentioned in my previous tutorial, and maybe in some rare instances 60. But VSDC allows you to export up to 120 frames per second, and I think that's probably one of the reasons why they are using milliseconds, in addition to the fact that VSDC is developed in Russia, and so in European countries they tend to use metric units. So when I move by one frame, I'm actually moving by more than 1 millisecond. In this example, I filmed in 30 frames per second, and that is also the frame rate for my project. So you will see that every time I hit the arrow button and move by one frame, my timecode is going to jump by 33 milliseconds. This is because one frame is 1/30th of a second, and that is 33 1/1000ths of a second, so therefore it is 33 milliseconds. Okay, now we've looked at the timeline. The next thing on your mind is probably where are all your media files, meaning the audio, video, and image files that you have imported into the project. So this is directly to the right-hand side of the timeline and the viewing monitor. This window here has 2 tabs, the resources window as well as the properties box. The resources window is where you have a laundry list of all the media that you have in your project. So these would be the raw and unedited files. And if you have been unhappy with whatever you did in your editing, you can still find the raw file here to drag it back into your timeline and re-edit. The properties box is something that will come up if you have a piece of media in your timeline that you select. So in this case, I have to select the clip, and you can see that once it's selected, there is this green outline around it. And I can see all the metadata, including the parameters that I can tweak in this properties box here. Some of these properties are common things that you will soon start to repeat and remember, but others can be quite technical. So in short, the potential for controlling and customizing everything in your timeline is vast and almost limitless. Now I'm going to move to the window that's on the left of the viewing monitor. And the first two tabs that I'll touch on are the Project and the Objects Explorer. To really appreciate the need for these two windows, you need to pull up a project that is relatively complex, and here is my previous tutorial. So you can see that the Project Explorer lists out the various scenes that are in the video. And each scene means that you can break down the video into smaller and more manageable parts. So for example, here scene 0 was about the first 6 minutes of the tutorial, and it already looks really crazy. So when I started a new concept, I decided to move on to a new scene, and VSDC is going to then stitch all these scenes seamlessly together so that they are going to play in that order as a single video. And humans like to start counting at 1, but computers like to start to count at 0. So that is why you have scenes 0, then 1, and then 2. Okay, so now on to the Objects Explorer. Just as the Resources window had all the unedited media that you put into the project, the Objects Explorer is a laundry list of all your edited media. So if you have cut a clip into multiple parts, it's going to show each of those parts as a single object. To be honest, I rarely make use of this window unless I am really looking for something very specific. So for example, here in this project, I had used a Gaussian blur and I had wanted to change it into a pixelized effect. So I can type in Gaussian blur here to try to search whether I have any, and it looks like there are none. And then when I look for pixelized, I can see all the clips that I have applied a pixelized effect to. Okay, now on to the workspaces that have to do with enhancing your media. For most people, this is going to be the fun part because it is all about adding effects to make things look better. So on the left-hand window still, we have this third tab called the Template Explorer. And that is a new feature that came in just this year. It contains all of the effects that you can add onto your video, and you can just drag and drop them into the clip that you want to add them to in the timeline. On the far right, you have the Basic Effects menu. This is all about making color adjustments, and you can do anything from the fairly standard saturation, brightness, and contrast adjustments to using a color wheel and RGB curves. I'm going to be talking in a lot more detail about this in a future tutorial on color. On top, there is a ribbon menu, and if you have worked with Microsoft Office programs, you'll find that this is quite familiar. But there's one area that I need to explain, which is the difference between the Edit and the Editor menus. The one that you are going to want to remember is Editor, because that's where you'll be spending a lot of time as you're editing your video. It contains all the video editing functions. Things like this razor icon for splitting clips. There are rotate icons. This is also where you have the menus for adding effects and importing your various clips. On the other hand, Edit functions very much like it does in Microsoft PowerPoint. It contains functions like undo, redo, aligning, and grouping images. And quite a number of these functions are also repeated along the toolbar that surrounds your viewing monitor. So once you get familiar with what the icons mean, you can actually do it really quickly without having to open up this ribbon toolbar. The rest of the ribbon menus are things that you work with less often. For example, Scene and Project really are for adding scenes and saving your project. View is for you to adjust the windows that you see in your interface so that you can remove things that you don't want in order that you don't feel overwhelmed. And Export is for you to create the final video file when you are done with editing. This is really just the beginning. There are so many features and concepts, as you can see, to explore and unpack. And in my next tutorial, I'm going to go through the basic processes that you need in order to finish a first simple project. ranging from bringing in your media to this project, to being able to work with them on the timeline and to manipulate the layers on the timeline. Thank you for watching and see you next time.